Survivors of the Egyptian ferry disaster arrive back on land as the search continues for hundreds still missing. A stampede at a stadium in the Philippines has killed at least 66 people and left many others injured. Muslims protest at cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad as the US and UK criticise their republication. And space junk or meteor, astronauts send an unwanted suit into orbit. Hello and welcome to BBC News with me, Jake Lynch. Rescue efforts are continuing off the seacoast of Egypt after a ferry sank with around 1,400 people on board. More than 300 survivors have been pulled from the sea, but most of the passengers and crew are still missing. It's feared the number of dead may be extremely high. The ferry went down without sending a distress signal as it sailed from Duba in Saudi Arabia to Safaga in Egypt. That report just coming in a moment. Well, for the latest on that story, we can hear now from Lindsay Wise, who's a freelance journalist at a hospital where the survivors have been taken. She said details are now emerging about how the tragedy happened.
We're hearing that there was a fire on the boat, or possibly several fires, and that the boat sank after this fire. And that many people were jumping into the water, that were swimming and trying to save their lives, and that they were 50 people to a single safety boat, or rescue boat, one of the inflatable ones from the ship. And apparently people were in these boats for hours, and one man told us he was there from about 3 a.m. in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, and that the boats were overcrowded, there was water in the boats, people were freezing, and it was quite a chaotic scene from what I can understand.
And so far as we can tell, was it ever an option for the vessel to turn back to its port of origin, and was the decision not to do so possibly the fateful one here?
Yeah, I don't. From what I'm hearing here from survivors, I've heard one man say that there was originally they first, realized there was something wrong when there was a smell of smoke on the boat, and that everywhere they were told everything was okay to go back to their rooms and go to bed, and then an hour later the boat was sinking. So, or maybe possibly less than that. So clearly there was people were upset. They felt that they weren't well taken care of. That they weren't told what was going on, and I think the families here feel the same way. They've been given very little information. They've been barred by state security from entering the hospital. So there's a lot of chaos here, a lot of confusion, a lot of mourning.
And briefly, Lindsay, you spent the day at the port there with relatives waiting for news. Pretty desperate atmosphere among people there now.
It was extremely tense at the port. People had come from all over Egypt to wait and hear news of their loved ones, and many of them had come literally from miles away, driven for hours, and they had been waiting all day long to hear any news at all. And I spoke actually to one man who'd been waiting there who was missing 13 members of his family, another who was waiting to hear from an entire family of parents, 2 parents and 5 children. A lot of very sad stories, and unfortunately not a lot of good news today. It seems that there were, the survivors are in the hundreds, and with a boat full of at least it sounds like 1,400 people, that's not good odds, unfortunately.
Well, that was Lindsay Wise, and we'll have that full report on the Egypt ferry disaster a little later in the programme. In the Philippines, at least 66 people have been killed in a stampede outside a sports stadium. The incident occurred in the Manila suburb of Pasig early on Saturday as tens of thousands of people were waiting to get inside the Ultra Stadium to watch a popular television game show. Our correspondent Sarah Toms is in Manila. She explained what triggered the stampede.
At the moment, details are very sketchy still, but what I understand is that people had been camping outside the sports stadium for days to get tickets to an anniversary celebration of a very popular television game show. Now, tickets were started to be handed out at dawn, and people were pushing to get the tickets when someone in the crowd apparently shouted "bomb," which caused amazing panic as people were pushing for the tickets and pushing to get out, and many were crushed against a steel fence.
And what kind of people were queuing to get in, do we know?
No, well, I mean, the Wow Wowee show is one of the most watched on daytime television, and it featured large prizes of cash and merchandise. So, I mean, I think obviously it would be people who would be hoping to get their hands on some cash or followers of the show. I would say probably more from poorer people would be trying. The fact that they were camping out for 3 days to get in is a good indicator of that.
Now, Manila is well accustomed, of course, to large movements of people, large numbers of people for various reasons, political protests, religious ceremonies and so on. What are safety precautions like generally? I mean, was this, in a sense, an accident waiting to happen?
I would say so. I mean, precaution. The Philippines is obviously famous for having lots of ferry disasters. People had been queuing for days. I'm not sure of the security that was in place, but the Philippines isn't well known for great security when it comes to events like this.
Sarah Toms. The United States and Britain have criticised European newspapers for republishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that have offended many Muslims and led to angry protests in a number of countries. In Washington, the State Department described the cartoons as offensive and said it was not acceptable to incite ethnic and religious hatred. Britain's Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said freedom of speech did not entail an obligation to insult. Cartoons were first published last year in Denmark. Well, Dr. Yunus Tainaz, spokesman for the Islamic Cultural Centre and the London Central Mosque, is among those demanding an apology from Denmark.
Well, the Danish and the government and the newspaper must apologize to the Muslim community. These cartoons are offensive and cause anger among all Muslims all over the world.
Well, now, you and your fellow Muslims who live in European countries enjoy the freedoms that come with that, greater freedoms in many cases than you would enjoy in Muslim countries. Don't you have to accept that those freedoms entail having to put up with cartoons which are really rather silly and ignorant forms of cultural expression? Shouldn't you really be rising above them and not giving them this credence?
Well, valued freedom in Europe shouldn't be used as a license to cause hatred and divide among high diversity communities in Europe. As a Muslims in Europe, we have human rights, and the government should protect these human rights. Causing hatred is not acceptable.
And yet, if you're calling on governments to step in and prevent newspapers from publishing such material, you're calling on governments to become censors. Now, that may have very serious consequences for some of your fellow Muslims.
No, we are not calling for the government to become censors at all. We respect other people, religions and belief, and also we respect other people, ideologies, and in return, we need people to respect our religion.
Will you, though, condemn the campaign to boycott Danish produce, for example? I mean, after all, a farm worker in Denmark producing butter, for example, which is then exported to Saudi Arabia, that farm worker has no control over what a newspaper does.
Well, this cartoonist has been, they are racist, they are offensive, and we got rights to boycott Danish products unless the Danish government and the newspaper apologize clearly to the Muslim community.
The UN nuclear agency, the IAEA, has delayed a vote on reporting Iran to the UN Security Council over its nuclear program. It's trying to gain more support for the move before it meets on Saturday. Iran has warned that if it is reported to the Security Council, it'll expand its uranium enrichment program and prevent international inspections. Israeli forces have clashed with Hezbollah guerrillas in a disputed area where the borders of Israel, Lebanon and Syria meet. Hezbollah is said to have attacked an Israeli army position in the area known as Shabar Farms. Israel responded with air attacks against the group's bases in southern Lebanon. The Israeli military has been put on high alert in the area. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is in Gaza to begin talks with leaders of the militant Islamic group Hamas after their parliamentary election victory. Mr. Abbas has not yet asked Hamas to form a new government, but he says it should respect commitments made by the Palestinian Authority. Hamas said on Friday it would never recognise Israel, but might be willing to negotiate terms for a temporary truce. The United States National Intelligence Director John Negroponte has accused Venezuela of attempting to strengthen its military ties with Iran and North Korea. An escalating row between the US and Venezuela has led to the expulsion of a diplomat on each side. The US State Department said it had no choice but to respond in kind after Caracas accused a US naval attaché of spying. Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez is in Cuba to pick up a prestigious UNESCO award for his efforts in the field of Latin American integration and culture.
President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela is always welcome in Cuba. His friendship with the Cuban leader Fidel Castro is stronger than ever.
Well, I'm going to read this poem, which is an honour for me, and I would like to humbly say that I'd like to read this in honour of the International Book Fair and the Cuban people, whom I love as much as my own. I love Cuba more each day.
The opposite could be said of his relations with the US. They've hit rock bottom. President Chavez has lost a top diplomat at his Washington embassy. The US government has expelled the deputy ambassador in response to an American military attaché being ordered to leave Venezuela on allegations of spying on Mr. Chavez.
We don't like to get into tit-for-tat games like this with the Venezuelan government, but they initiated this and we were forced to respond.
Venezuela's left-wing leader is being celebrated in Havana for his efforts to unify Latin America against US dominance in the region. But the UNESCO award he is being given is unlikely to win him friends in Washington. Greg Mosbach, BBC News, Caracas.
The United Nations Security Council has opened the way for a new peacekeeping force to be sent to Darfur in Western Sudan to halt the violence that's displaced over 2 million people. A statement praised African Union peacekeepers who've been operating in the region, but said that a force with a stronger capability is required. 10 Somali men captured by the US Navy last month have pleaded not guilty to charges of piracy. The trial is intended to deter pirates off the lawless Horn of Africa. At the hearing in Kenya, the 10 men said they'd been illegally kidnapped by an American ship in an area that's seen an increase in attacks and hijackings over the last year. They face a possible life sentence if found guilty. You're watching BBC News. Still ahead on the programme, how the American Super Bowl is helping to turn around the fortunes of Detroit. Maoist rebels in Nepal have shot dead a second pro-government candidate ahead of Wednesday's municipal elections. The attack in the candidate's home in eastern Nepal came despite tightened security by the royal government. The Maoists have issued death threats against candidates and called a 7-day general strike aimed at disrupting the polls.
When it was announced the king was marking Wednesday's anniversary with a proclamation, some feared he'd take still tougher measures to curb dissent than he had already. Others predicted a relaxation. In the end, there was neither. The monarch's main message was that these controversial local elections will go ahead. He said they would consolidate democracy. But it's proving to be democracy at a price. Ballot boxes have been prepared, nominations registered, but the Maoists have now killed 2 candidates, kidnapped another, and, in Kathmandu itself, tried to kill a 4th. Hundreds of candidates have withdrawn in fright. Many more are being protected by armed guards, whether they like it or not. The Maoists have been fighting here for 10 years this month. Their leaders have responded to a United Nations Human Rights Office query by saying they have no policy of violence against candidates in these elections, but they haven't condemned the killings. This week they've continued attacking urban centres, killing at least 11 while partially destroying the historic town of Tansen. The mainstream political parties, meanwhile, want the elections boycotted. And this week they've gone on demonstrating against the polls and against what they say is government suppression of civil liberties in the name of fighting the Maoists. On Friday, in a now regular scenario, dozens of would-be demonstrators were arrested. Charles Haviland, BBC News, Kathmandu.
5 people have been killed in several gas explosions in private homes in Ukraine. 17 others were injured. The explosions, which destroyed 2 houses, were caused by gas leaks from domestic pipes. Criminal proceedings have been brought on the cases, but experts have said last week's extreme cold temperatures damaged the pipes. British Royal Navy ships have made one of their largest ever drug hauls from a cargo ship in the Caribbean. The Ministry of Defence says more than 3 tons of cocaine was seized after a high-speed boat chase. The cocaine would have had a street value of over $600 million. The headlines this hour. Survivors of the ferry disaster in the Red Sea have started arriving back on land. Rescuers are still searching for hundreds more who were on the ship when it sank. At least 66 people have died after a stampede at a stadium in the Philippines. Tens of thousands were waiting to watch a television game show. And the US and British governments have criticised newspapers for republishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that have led to angry protests around the world. Well, let's return to our main story now. About 1,000 people are still missing after the Egyptian ferry sank in the Red Sea. The Salam 98 went down without sending a distress signal.
These are the lucky ones, the survivors of the doomed ferry Al Salam 98. They were brought ashore hours after being rescued from the Red Sea. Some looked bewildered, but others were able to describe what happened on board. This woman talked about a fire in the ship's engine room and efforts by the crew to try and put out the flames. Other survivors said that some passengers jumped overboard whilst people tried to cram into the ship's lifeboats. Huge crowds gathered outside hospitals as ambulances brought survivors in for treatment. There were 1,400 people on board, many of them Egyptian workers returning from Saudi Arabia, as well as pilgrims coming home from the Hajj. The vessel had disappeared off radar screens late on Thursday night and sank without even issuing a distress signal. There have already been questions about the ship's seaworthiness.
The rolling motion combined with fairly strong gust of wind can happen, the ship can capsize fairly quickly. We are talking in terms of less than a minute.
At the ferry's destination, the Egyptian port of Safaga, hundreds of distressed relatives gathered, desperate for news. This desperation turned to anger for some as they tried to find out about loved ones. In the Red Sea, the search and rescue operation continues, with aircraft and ships scouring for any more survivors. Only by the end of Saturday is it likely to be more clear how many people have been rescued and how many have perished in this disaster. Richard Forrest, BBC News.
Security has been tightened across Haiti as it prepares for its first presidential election since a violent rebellion 2 years ago. The rise in tension has forced one of the leading candidates to cancel an election rally. Haitians go to the polls on Tuesday for the first time since Jean-Bertrand Aristide was ousted in February 2004.
On the streets of Haiti's capital, there's tight security. United Nations peacekeepers and Haitian police officers work alongside each other trying to keep order. Roads are lined with vandalised campaign posters for an election which has already been postponed 4 times because of security and organisational issues. UN officials have told the 3.5 million voters they will be protected at polling stations, and its head of the electoral observers is confident polling will go ahead this time.
It's necessary that Tuesday's elections go as orderly as possible under very difficult conditions. We want people to go out and vote en masse. It's a decisive moment for the country.
Since President Aristide fled 2 years ago, Haiti has slipped into chaos, with gang violence gripping the country. Hundreds of people have been killed and nearly 2,000 people kidnapped for ransom in the last year. Just last week, 3 French nationals, including a nun, were captured before being released unharmed. There are 35 candidates standing in the presidential election. So far this man, former President René Préval, is leading the opinion polls. But despite his popularity, his final election rally on Saturday won't be going ahead because of violence. His main rival is the industrialist Charles Baker. He's not aligned to any political party and his campaign is dominated by the security issue. But one of the most colourful candidates is the former rebel leader Guy Philippe, who swapped his military uniform for a suit and tie. He helped lead the rebellion against President Aristide in 2004. The second round of voting is scheduled for mid-March. And it's hoped these elections will finally bring the peace that Haiti desperately needs. Lee Jelisek, BBC News.
In the United States, 3 churches have been burned to the ground and 2 others badly damaged. Building work is thought to be the cause of one blaze, but police say that until their investigation is complete, they're treating all 5 as suspicious. All of the churches are in Alabama, most are Baptist and close to major roads. So far, no arrests have been made. In Washington, the trial of the former White House aide, Louis Scooter Libby, has been postponed until next year. The former Chief of Staff to Vice President Dick Cheney faces charges of perjury and obstructing justice. Mr. Libby, who is implicated following an inquiry into the leak of a CIA agent's identity, entered a plea of not guilty at Friday's hearing. Now, this weekend, millions of Americans will be watching what is for many the biggest sporting event of the year, the Super Bowl. The game is between the Seattle Seahawks and the Pittsburgh Steelers, and even though it's not until Sunday, there's already a winner, this year's host city of Detroit. Brian Barron looks now at how a hard-hit industrial city that's been in decline is getting a Super Bowl boost.
Even the Super Bowl stadium has the stamp of Detroit's car industry. It was the car bosses who paid for the week's first big Super Bowl party. Motor City has recruited its biggest guns to promote its own revival.
Detroit.
The D.
Motown. The Motor City.
But a chill hangs over these Ford workers at a bowling night. Detroit's mainstay is losing billions. Is there much hardship?
Oh yeah, a lot of people losing their jobs, houses, cars, everything like that.
We need to get it back to the way it was in the 70s, 80s. That was our prime time.
But revival here has a long way to go. Hundreds of thousands of residents fled Detroit in past decades because of crime and racial tension. Strapped for cash, Detroit has axed its prize-winning mounted police unit. The horses are cared for by well-wishers around Detroit. The officers have either retired or do desk jobs.
The city suddenly found itself in dire straits financially. I don't know why they didn't figure this out before.
Their neighborhoods. Among the city council's latest recruits is veteran entertainer Martha Reeves, a diva who helped create the Motown sound. One of her old haunts, the Motown Records building, was levelled the other day to make way for a Super Bowl car park. But the diva says its time was up.
People say that our stock is going to be junk and that the city is on the decline. When you look around and see all these new development and see all of the new transitions that the Super Bowl has prompted, I see Detroit on the uprise.
Detroit today is being pulled in opposite directions. There are truly hopeful signs like this urban renewal not far from the downtown and the promise of a richer future with events like the weekend Super Bowl football. Then there's the shadowy, collapsed Detroit. The derelict symbols of the still shrinking car industry need removing. They're inspired by the Super Bowl, but will there be jobs here for this generation? Brian Barron, BBC News, Detroit.
2 astronauts living aboard the International Space Station have thrown out an old spacesuit to see what happens to it. It's complete with helmet and gloves and is currently floating around in space in roughly the same orbit as the space station. Part science and part prank, the suit is being tracked by amateur radio enthusiasts back on Earth.
Boldly going where no empty spacesuit has gone before.
Goodbye, Mr. Smith. Yeah, we can see him.
And there was the deployment of SuitSat.
Flying away.
Its pioneering 6-day mission may not be to seek out new worlds, rather its job is to travel round our own. For it is not just an empty suit. In fact, it's part of a project known as SuitSat-1. It is filled with clothes, batteries and a radio transmitter. And complete with helmet and gloves, Commander Bill MacArthur launches it from the International Space Station. Its mission is to drift in orbit, sending out recorded messages in 6 languages to amateur radio operators around the globe. SuitSat-1 is the brainchild of a Russian ham radio operator. The messages will contain several words in code for school children listening on the ground.
About one orbit or 90 minutes from now, it should be about 8 kilometers away from the International Space Station, maintaining...
Along with the radio transmitter, it's also fitted with telemetry to monitor temperature, battery power and the time it has been in space. It is expected to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up some stage next week. Hardly the way to treat a pioneer. Ian Pocock, BBC News.
And the main news again. Frantic rescue efforts are continuing off the Red Sea coast of Egypt, where a ferry has sunk with at least 1,300 people on board. More than 300 survivors have been pulled from the sea. And officials in the Philippines say a stampede at a stadium in Manila has killed at least 66 people. They were queuing to watch the recording of a popular game show in a sports stadium. That's it from BBC News for now. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Hello there. Certainly was a cold February day for many of us yesterday. Through the weekend, you'll notice those temperatures just creeping up a degree or so, but overnight, those temperatures have dropped off low enough for a touch of frost across the UK. Temperatures close to or just below freezing, and we've got some patchy fog to contend with. No fog problems across Wales this morning, but certainly a touch of frost. Temperatures pretty close to freezing and a good deal of cloud around, but it should be a dry start to the day. Dry too across Northern Ireland, but here we've got some dense fog to contend with. Really poor visibility on those roads. Maybe not quite so cold. 4 degrees in Belfast through the morning. Similar temperatures for Glasgow, but here through the central lowlands we will see some fog, as we will through Cumbria. The northeast of Scotland, northeastern England, a bright start to the day. But across the bulk of England and Wales, I suspect a good deal of cloud around through the morning. Quite chilly as well, and certainly a touch of frost through the Midlands, down through the West Country and on down through Devon and Cornwall. But it will be a dry, if a rather cloudy start to the day. Now through the morning, 1 or 2 spots favoured to see something a little bit brighter. Western Wales, the southwest of England, maybe a glimpse of sunshine from time to time, but most of England and Wales, I suspect, stays pretty cloudy on into the afternoon. The best of brightness towards the north and the east. And there should be a few spells of sunshine in Northern Ireland away from that fog, but the fog could well linger on well into the afternoon. Let's take a look at things through the afternoon across Scotland, and a bright afternoon for central and eastern areas. The sunshine helping those temperatures up to around about 8 degrees in Aberdeen. Some of that fog will linger all day across Cumbria. That will suppress those temperatures, but northern England, I think, we'll see the cloud thinning and breaking, little bits of sunshine from time to time, but the bulk of England and Wales, it remains pretty grey into the afternoon. Maybe not quite as grey as it was yesterday, maybe not quite so cold as well. 4 degrees in London, maybe up to around about 3 or so in Cardiff and Plymouth. And from time to time, down towards the southwest, we will see a glimpse of the sun. And a glimpse of the sun too for northern parts of Wales, and away from the fog in Northern Ireland, it should be a bright day with some decent spells of sunshine, but in that fog, temperatures really will struggle. Come Sunday, I think a little bit more in the way of sunshine for England and Wales. The best of the sunshine probably for eastern Scotland, the northeast of England. Those temperatures creeping up a degree or so, so 5 or 6 for Cardiff and Plymouth. Come Monday, again, little change really. Still the best of the brightness in that northeastern corner. A good deal of cloud elsewhere. 6s and 7s by this stage, your temperatures, but you'll notice a band of rain beginning to creep into the far northwest. Now that band of rain will be pushing its way south on Tuesday. Haven't seen some rain across the UK for quite some time, and that band of rain will spread its way south, and that will bring some welcome rain to many of us.
The beacons are lit. They're sighted off the Cornish coast.
Then it begins. If they turn against you, there is no protection for you here.
Henceforth, if I see you, I shall not know you. You are dead to me.
To My England, with love.
The Virgin Queen, tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
A perfect landing and you take gold. Miss, you take the bus home. At 360 degrees, you stand a chance. 3 degrees out, no chance. 84 miles an hour here, you're going through. 84 here, you're going nowhere. The Winter Olympics starts Friday on the BBC. No margin for error.
Hello, I'm Jake Lynch with the main news. An intensive search operation is continuing to find survivors from an Egyptian ferry which sank in the Red Sea with 1,400 people on board. Some of the survivors of the disaster have started arriving back on land. The ship, the Salam 98, went down on a night crossing from Saudi Arabia to Egypt in the early hours. More than 300 survivors have been pulled from the sea, but most of the passengers and crew are still missing. Survivors are reported to have said the ship began listing heavily minutes after a fire broke out on board. In the Philippines, at least 66 people have been killed in a stampede outside a sports stadium. The incident occurred in a Manila suburb early on Saturday, as tens of thousands of people were waiting to get inside the Ultra Stadium to watch a popular TV game show. The crush began as tickets were being handed out for the event. There have been more protests in Europe and across the Islamic world following the publication of cartoons